He proposed to the most overlooked woman in the room to win a wager. She simply said yes. What he didn't know, the quiet duchess he married to mock, was the one woman every assassin in England had been hunting for 18 years. The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the carriages arrived at Blackmere Hall, the Yorkshire moors had disappeared entirely beneath a white silence. Inside, however, there was nothing silent about it. Crystal chandeliers threw amber light across 200 of England's finest, tailcoats pressed sharp enough to cut glass, diamond brooches catching the candle flame. The long banquet tables groaned under pheasant, roasted boar, syllabub and claret, and the laughter that rose and fell across the room had the particular cruelty that only comes when the rich grow bored after the third bottle. Duke Cedric Whitmore sat at the head of the finest table, as he always did, because rooms arranged themselves around him whether he wished it or not. He was 31, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that portrait painters charged extra for. He had inherited his title at 19, his arrogance considerably earlier, and he wore both without apology. Lords competed for his attention, ladies arranged themselves where he might notice them. He noticed very few. He was halfway through a glass of Bordeaux when the mockery began. It started quietly, the way these things always do. A whisper behind a gloved hand, a smothered laugh. Then Lord Ashby, red-faced, perpetually drunk on someone else's generosity, raised his voice just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Good God," Ashby said, peering across the room. "Who invited the Ashcombe woman?" Cedric glanced toward the far end of the hall, where a woman stood near the doorway in a gown of deep green wool. Lady Helena Ashcombe. He recognized her only vaguely, minor nobility, rarely seen at gatherings like this. She was a large woman, heavy-set in a way that the fashionable world considered worthy of comment, and she stood alone, holding a small cup of warm negus, looking at nobody in particular. She was not cowering. That was the first thing Cedric noticed. She simply stood there, with the composed stillness of someone who had long ago stopped expecting the room to be kind. The laughter around Ashby's table grew bolder. "She's let herself go since her father died," someone murmured. "Was she ever otherwise?" another replied. Lord Percival Graves, Cedric's closest companion since Eton, leaned close and spoke in a low, amused tone. "There is your challenge for the evening, Cedric. I dare you to dance with her." "I don't dance with dares," Cedric said. "No, you don't dance at all," Percival replied, swirling his claret. "Which is why I'll raise the stakes to something more interesting." He said it loudly enough, Cedric realized too late, for the surrounding tables to hear. "I'll wager 50 guineas that the great Duke of Whitmore hasn't got the stomach to court that woman for a single month." The tables around them went quiet, in that particular way that means everyone is listening very hard while pretending not to. Cedric felt the shift in the room, every eye sliding toward him without appearing to move. He had spent his life performing confidence for rooms exactly like this one, and something old and prideful in him rose automatically to the surface. "A month," he repeated. "1 calendar month," Percival said pleasantly. "You'd not last a fortnight. Society would chew you alive." The laughter that followed was the kind meant to provoke, and it worked, because it always worked on men like Cedric, which was precisely why Percival had chosen it. Cedric set down his glass, straightened his cuffs, and stood. The room watched. He crossed the length of the hall with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once doubted that other people would move out of his way. They did. The laughter faded as he approached Helena Ashcombe, who watched him come with an expression that gave nothing away. He stopped before her, inclined his head, and said clearly enough for half the room to hear, "Lady Helena, I have been remiss in not greeting you sooner. I wonder whether you would do me the considerable honor of accepting my hand in marriage." Complete silence. Then the room exploded. Gasps, a dropped fork, someone actually knocked over their wine. Cedric kept his eyes on Helena and his expression perfectly composed, inwardly certain she would refuse, and he could leave with his pride intact and the evening's entertainment secured. She did not refuse. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes moving across his face with something he could not quite name, something uncomfortably close to recognition. Then she set her cup of negus down on a passing footman's tray, smoothed the front of her gown, and said, quite simply, "Very well, Your Grace. I accept." The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality. Cedric had not expected that. His smile remained fixed through sheer discipline, while something cold moved through him. He extended his hand to shake hers in the formal manner, and she placed her gloved fingers across his palm. The glove shifted slightly. Just below the edge of the fabric, where her wrist met her palm, he caught the edge of something. A scar. Old, pale, raised. Running at an angle that no household accident ever made. He had seen enough dueling injuries and cavalry wounds in his years at court to know what a blade did to skin. He said nothing. He released her hand. He smiled at the room. But as he turned back toward his table, the composure he wore so easily felt, for the first time in years, like something he was genuinely working to maintain. That night, after the carriages had gone and the hall had emptied, a lone rider sat motionless at the tree line beyond Blackmere's eastern gate. Snow settled on the horse's mane. The rider made no move to leave for a long while, watching the last candles go dark in the upper windows. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the dark without a sound. 3 days was not enough time for gossip to die. It was, however, enough time for it to sharpen. By the morning of the wedding, every drawing room from York to Harrogate had formed an opinion. The general verdict was that Cedric Whitmore had either lost his mind or made some catastrophic error in judgment, and the only reason anyone showed any restraint in saying so publicly was because one did not, as a rule, openly insult a duke. The chapel of St. Albans stood a few miles outside York, on a grey stretch of country road where the hedgerows grew untrimmed and the gateposts leaned slightly from years of wet winters. Rain came down in steady curtains, darkening the old stone walls to the color of iron. A small crowd of villagers huddled beneath the oak trees outside, not close enough to be forward, but near enough to see. Word had spread quickly through the villages. People wanted to look at the woman who had said yes. Cedric arrived first. He stood at the altar in a dark charcoal tailcoat with a white cravat tied simply at his throat, no elaborate finery, nothing that announced itself too loudly. Beside him, Percival served as witness with the polished ease of a man who felt entirely comfortable attending a spectacle he had personally arranged. Cedric had not slept particularly well. He told himself it was the strangeness of the situation. A month, he reminded himself. 1 month, and the wager would be settled, and he would arrange a quiet and mutually agreeable separation from this woman he barely knew. Society would forget. These things happened. He was thinking all of this when Helena walked through the chapel door. She wore ivory, not the elaborate silk confections currently fashionable in London, no seed pearls, no lace flounces stacked to the shoulder, none of the theatrical excess that wealthy brides used to announce themselves. Her gown was clean-lined and quietly expensive, the kind of thing that suggested taste rather than display. She wore no tiara. Her dark hair was dressed simply. She carried a small bunch of white hellebore, winter flowers, the kind that grew in frozen ground. She walked without hesitation. What struck Cedric, and he noticed it before he could stop himself, was how the servants moved when she passed. 2 older members of the chapel staff, men who had no connection to Helena whatsoever as far as Cedric knew, bowed their heads as she walked by, deeply. The kind of bow that was not performed out of politeness, but out of something older than politeness. He filed it away without comment. The ceremony was brief and proper. The vicar read the words. Cedric made his responses in a clear voice. Helena made hers in a voice equally clear, and when she looked at him during the exchange of vows, she looked at him directly, without shyness or resentment, just that same unreadable composure. Afterward, standing outside the chapel in the rain while the small party prepared the carriages, Percival appeared at Cedric's elbow, wearing a smile that had always meant he was pleased with himself. "She actually came," Percival said. "She did." "You didn't expect that?" "No," Cedric admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise with Percival. Percival watched Helena speak quietly to an elderly servant near the chapel gate. "Neither did I, if I'm honest." A pause, then, carefully, "I should tell you something. The wager wasn't entirely spontaneous." Cedric turned. Percival continued with the same pleasant expression he used for everything. "You've been rather too well regarded at court lately. The Hartfield appointment, the Pemberton business, men have noticed. Some of us find your continued ascent somewhat tedious." He adjusted his gloves. "The wager was designed to embarrass you, Cedric, not Helena, though I'll admit the outcome has surprised me considerably." He strolled away before Cedric could respond. Cedric stood in the rain and understood that he had walked very willingly into something that had been built specifically to trap him. The particular anger that followed was not the loud kind, it was the quiet kind, which in Cedric's experience was considerably more durable. The carriages moved out onto the road toward Northumberland shortly after noon. Cedric sat across from Helena in the first carriage, the silence between them neither comfortable nor hostile. She watched the passing fields through the rain-streaked window. He watched her watch them. He was about to say something polite and entirely meaningless when the carriage lurched violently. Shouts outside, the driver's voice rising, then 3 sharp cracks in rapid succession, unmistakably pistol shots, close enough to make the horses scream. Helena moved before Cedric had fully understood what was happening. Her hand struck his shoulder, pushing him sideways and down across the seat with a force entirely inconsistent with someone acting on instinct alone. The carriage window above him exploded inward, glass raining across the leather seat, a bullet hole clean through the wood paneling directly behind where his head had been a half-second earlier. Outside, hooves, men shouting. Then silence again, nearly as sudden as the attack itself. Helena sat upright, breathing steadily, and looked out through the shattered window. One of the riders had pulled back. Through the fog, Cedric could see the man staring at Helena, motionless in his saddle. Then the man's voice came across the wet road, raw and disbelieving. "The princess lives." He wheeled his horse and vanished into the gray. Cedric asked her 3 times on the road to Northumberland. Each time, Helena gave him the same answer. The attackers were confused, mistaken identity. It happened on rural roads, particularly in uncertain weather. She said it with such calm that a less observant man might have believed her. Cedric was many things, but unobservant was not among them. He let it go. For the moment. Whitmore Estate announced itself from half a mile away, a long Palladian frontage of pale stone rising above bare winter trees, its many windows reflecting the gray February sky. It was an impressive house, and Cedric knew it, the way he knew most things about himself, plainly and without embarrassment. A staff of 30 waited in 2 lines at the entrance, housemaids on one side, footmen on the other, breath clouding in the cold air. Helena stepped from the carriage and stopped. She looked at the house for a moment in a way Cedric could not interpret, not awe, something quieter than that. Then she thanked the footman who had opened the carriage door by name, though she had never been here before and could not have known it, and walked inside. By the end of the first week, the house had changed. It was difficult to say exactly how, because no single thing was dramatically different. But the atmosphere shifted the way a room shifts when someone opens a window that has been sealed for years. Helena learned every servant's name within 2 days. She remembered details,
a kitchen maid's sick brother, a groundskeeper's bad knee, an elderly housekeeper's preference for tea over coffee, and asked after them the following morning as though these were matters of genuine interest, because apparently they were.
The neglected kitchen garden, which had been left to freeze untended since the previous autumn, she had cleared and replanted with the quiet authority of someone who understood what grew in cold ground. The long gallery, which had accumulated a decade of disorganized furniture and forgotten portraits, she began restoring without being asked, identifying pieces correctly by period and provenance in ways that required either an excellent education or a very specific one. Cedric watched all of it from a careful distance. He also discovered, on the fourth evening, that his new wife spoke French. He overheard her in the library, reading aloud from a volume of Voltaire, her pronunciation effortless and natural, the kind that came not from a governess and a grammar book, but from having spoken it somewhere, regularly, for years. 2 nights later, he passed the library again and heard Italian. He opened the door without knocking. She was standing at the large table with a map spread open before her, a candle held close. The map was old, its edges worn and stained, and it showed a region of continental Europe he didn't immediately recognize. When she heard him, she folded it, without rushing, slid it beneath a folio of household accounts, and looked up. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Nor could I," he replied. They regarded each other across the candlelit room, with the particular tension of two people who are each waiting to see what the other will reveal first. Neither revealed anything. Cedric wished her good night and left. He began paying attention to the estate's surroundings after that. Twice during the following week, the dogs in the stable yard began barking past midnight for no visible reason. A gamekeeper reported unusual footprints in the frost along the eastern boundary wall. 2 sets, possibly 3, gone by morning. One of the older footmen, a man named Garrett, who had served the Whitmore household for 20 years, came to Cedric quietly on a Thursday afternoon and said he needed to give his notice. He would not say why. When Cedric pressed him, the man looked genuinely frightened and said only that he had recognized someone he had hoped never to see again, and that it would be better for the household if he left. He was gone before supper. Cedric's mother arrived on a Saturday in a coach piled with luggage and grievance in equal measure. Lady Whitmore was a tall, angular woman whose opinions moved through a room ahead of her like weather. She lasted 40 minutes before she had said everything she intended to say. The marriage was disgraceful. The woman was wholly unsuitable. Society was already talking, and not charitably. The Whitmore name had survived 3 centuries of wars, debts, and scandals, and she would not see it undone by a wager made over claret by a son who ought to have known better. Cedric told her the marriage stood. She told him he was a fool and left the room. He did not disagree with her entirely, which was the most unsettling part. That same evening, he passed the portrait gallery on his way to dinner and stopped. Helena stood motionless before the large painting at the far end, a portrait of Queen Charlotte, painted in the previous century, displayed there because a former duchess had admired it. Helena's back was to him. Her shoulders were very still, and when he stepped closer, he realized she was crying. Silently, the way people cry when they have long practice at not being heard. He said nothing. He withdrew from the doorway before she turned. But he stood in the corridor for a while afterward, and for the first time since Blackmere Hall, the word that had been circling the edges of his thoughts for days finally arrived and refused to leave. "Who are you?" The letters were not hidden cleverly. That was what troubled Cedric most. They were tucked inside a French grammar book on the second shelf of Helena's sitting room, folded small, sealed with plain wax bearing no crest. He found them by accident while looking for a volume he'd lent her the previous week. He did not read them. He told himself this twice, firmly, then carried them to the window where the morning light was better and read every word. The language was not English. Most of it was written in a script he did not recognize at all. Angular, old, the kind of alphabet that belonged to somewhere specific and obscure. But one letter, shorter than the others, was written in French, and his French was sufficient. The message was brief and carried no signature. It said only that the matter could wait no longer, that those who remained had held their silence long enough, that she needed to come to the place she already knew, before the wrong people found it first. It was dated 4 days ago. Cedric replaced the letters exactly as he'd found them, returned the grammar book to its shelf, and went about the rest of his day with the outward composure of a man who had read nothing of particular interest. He waited. 3 nights later, at 1:30 in the morning, he watched from his darkened window as a cloaked figure crossed the kitchen garden below, moved through the gate in the far wall, and disappeared onto the coastal path heading north. He gave her 10 minutes. Then he followed. The Yorkshire coast in March was not a forgiving place. Wind came off the North Sea with the kind of force that made argument pointless, flattening the scrub grass and throwing salt spray far inland.
Cedric followed the cliff path in darkness, keeping enough distance that the sound of his boots was swallowed by the wind. The path descended sharply after 2 miles, cutting between chalk outcroppings toward a small cove where against the black cliff face, the low structure of a monastery pressed itself into the rock, as though trying not to be noticed. It was very old. The stonework predated anything Cedric could date with confidence. A single light burned behind a narrow window. The door stood slightly open. He waited outside in the shadows of the cliff and listened. The voices inside were low, but the wind had dropped enough for him to hear clearly. A man's voice, elderly, speaking in the same unrecognizable language from the letters. Then Helena's voice, responding in kind, fluent and rapid. Then silence. Then the old man switched to French, and Cedric's blood went cold by degrees as he understood. Her name was not Helena. It was Eleanor. Princess Eleanor of Valoria, the sole surviving daughter of King Aldrich, whose royal family had been massacred 18 years earlier during an uprising that the old monk described in a quiet, steady voice as having been quietly encouraged by certain British trade interests unwilling to negotiate fairly with a small nation that sat across a vital shipping corridor. Eleanor had been 6 years old. Her nursemaid had carried her out through a burning servants' passage while the palace fell. Loyalists had scattered her across Europe, then eventually to England, to the household of a minor noblewoman who asked no questions and kept her silence in exchange for a modest annual arrangement. Medicines had been administered consistently through her childhood and adolescence, compounds that altered her constitution gradually, thickened her frame, changed the shape of her face. The intention was protection. A princess who did not look like a princess could not be found by people looking for one. The scars on her wrists were from that first night, from the burning. The old monk was telling her that the loyalists were dying out, that the men who had killed her family had grown old and comfortable, but not careless enough, that a new faction had identified her location and the attacks on the road. Cedric's mind went immediately to the ambush, to the rider in the fog, were only the beginning. Eleanor said something firm in their language. Then she said, in French, that she would handle it herself, that she had not survived this long by relying on other people's plans. Then a floorboard shifted somewhere inside, and Eleanor's voice stopped entirely. She came through the door so quickly that Cedric stepped back, and the movement gave him away immediately. She stood in the doorway with the wind pulling at her cloak and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the composed stillness he had grown used to, but something rawer than that. Fury. And beneath the fury, something that looked very much like the particular pain of a person who has been proved right about something they desperately hoped to be wrong about. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough." She was quiet for a moment, the wind filling the silence between them. Then she said with a steadiness that made it worse rather than better,
So now you have something considerably more entertaining than a wager to tell your friends about. Helena, Eleanor, she said. My name is Eleanor. She walked past him and back toward the cliff path, and he stood at the monastery door in the dark with the sea crashing somewhere below and the very uncomfortable realization that he was ashamed of himself, genuinely, for the first time in years. London in April smelled of coal smoke and ambition. The city reassembled itself each spring with the reliability of a stage production, the same players, the same theatres, the same performances dressed in new fabric. Parliament reconvened, drawing rooms reopened, invitation cards multiplied across silver trays in entrance halls from Mayfair to Kensington, and the great social machinery of English society ground back into motion with considerable enthusiasm and very little mercy. Cedric brought Helena to Whitmore House on Park Lane in the second week of April. His reasoning was straightforward. Whoever wanted her dead knew where she was in Northumberland. London, with its crowds and noise and constant social traffic, offered a different kind of concealment. He told her this plainly. She listened without responding, looked out of the carriage window at the grey London streets, and said she understood the logic. She did not say she agreed with it. What followed was 4 weeks that Cedric would not easily forget. It began at the opera. They attended a performance of Don Giovanni at the King's Theatre on a Thursday evening, and by the time they had settled into their box, Cedric was aware of the lorgnettes. Every opera house had its particular geography of judgment, and the boxes opposite were occupied that evening by precisely the women whose opinions functioned as social weather across the whole of the city. Within 20 minutes of their arrival, the whispers had begun making their way around the horseshoe of gilded tiers with the quiet efficiency of a well-organized postal system. Helena sat straight-backed in blue silk and watched the stage. The newspapers were worse. By the following Monday, a cartoon had appeared in a popular publication, a crude illustration of a vast woman in a duchess's coronet sitting atop a collapsed chair while a thin, elegant duke looked on in theatrical horror. The caption read, "The Whitmore Arrangement." It was passed around gentlemen's clubs with considerable amusement. Cedric arrived at his club on Tuesday and found 3 copies of it arranged on the reading table in a manner too deliberate to be accidental. He said nothing, ordered his coffee, and read the morning papers with his usual composure. At home, Helena said nothing either. She learned the rhythm of the household quickly, managed the domestic arrangements with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to Northumberland, and spent her private hours reading in the upstairs library. She did not complain. She did not ask Cedric to defend her. She never once mentioned the newspapers. This, he found, was harder to witness than tears would have been. The royal charity dinner arrived on a Friday evening in the 3rd week. It was held at a private house in Grosvenor Square, the kind of event where attendance signaled respectability and absence was noted and interpreted. Cedric had considered declining. Helena had said they should go, in the same tone she used for entirely practical observations about household management. 40 guests sat down to dinner. The conversation moved in its predictable channels: Parliament, property, the Irish question, the latest military appointments. Helena sat quietly through the first 2 courses. Then Lord Harcastle, a large man with parliamentary ambitions and very little restraint, turned to her with the smile of someone who has prepared a question specifically to diminish, and asked whether she found London fatiguing, given how little she'd been seen in society previously. Helena set down her fish fork. She spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, about the coal towns of Northumberland, which several people at the table owned interests in without apparently having visited, about the war widows whose pension arrangements Parliament had twice delayed reviewing, about the factory children in Manchester whose working hours exceeded those of the draft horses that delivered goods to the very houses they sat in now. She spoke without raising her voice, without consulting notes, with the precision of someone who had gathered these facts not from pamphlets, but from standing in those places and watching with her own eyes. By the time she finished, the table was silent. Lord Harcastle had nothing further to add. Two members of Parliament on the opposite side of the table were looking at her with expressions that had moved, visibly and without apparent intention, from amusement to attention. Cedric looked at his wineglass and felt the complicated mixture of pride and guilt that had been following him since the monastery at Ravenscar. That night, he told her the truth. He waited until the house was quiet and found her in the library and told her everything. The wager, Percival's deliberate staging of it, the 50 guineas, the precise and calculated nature of the public proposal. He told it plainly, without softening it, because she deserved the plain version. She stood at the window with her back to him while he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Outside, a late carriage moved along the street below, the horse's hooves sharp on the cobblestones. Then she turned around, and her face had the look of someone absorbing a blow they had already half expected, but had chosen, against their better judgment, to hope would not come. She removed her wedding ring and placed it on the table between them. "I believed you were becoming someone worth trusting," she said quietly. She walked out of the library. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, unhurried, steady. Then her bedroom door closing softly. Before dawn, she was gone. She had taken nothing of value. Cedric discovered this at 6:30 in the morning, when he found her rooms empty and her wardrobe largely untouched. The jewelry he had provided remained in its case on the dressing table. The allowance he had arranged through his solicitor sat uncollected. She had taken a single traveling bag, a wool cloak, and the French grammar book with its hidden letters. Everything else was left behind, with the particular care of someone who wanted to owe nothing. He stood in her empty room for a while. Then he went downstairs, told the housekeeper that Her Grace had travelled ahead to Northumberland on personal business, and ordered his horse saddled within the hour. He was in Manchester by the following evening. His reasoning was loose, but it was all he had. She would avoid the main coaching roads, where faces were remembered and gossip travelled faster than wheels. She knew people outside aristocratic circles, the kind of people who asked fewer questions. And somewhere in England were the Valorian loyalists she had mentioned at Ravenscar, scattered through immigrant communities in the industrial cities. Manchester was as reasonable a starting point as any. He had never spent time in Manchester before. His connection to the north had always been the estate in Northumberland, the managed countryside, the tenant farmers, who removed their hats when his carriage passed. Manchester was something entirely different. The streets were narrow and darkened at midday by the smoke pouring from mill chimneys that rose above the rooftops, like a second city built in black over the first. The noise was constant and layered. Machinery, horses, street vendors, the persistent cough that seemed to belong to every second person he passed. He asked at coaching inns. He described Helena carefully, factually, without mentioning titles or circumstances. At the fourth inn, a stout landlady with a sharp face told him a woman of that description had stopped 2 nights ago and spoken at length with a family in the back room. She'd left a small amount of money with them. The landlady said it with the particular tone of someone reporting something they'd found unexpectedly decent. He moved south toward the Lake District on that information alone. It was slower going than he expected. The spring roads were soft from rain, and the packhorse tracks between villages frequently disappeared into fields of standing water. He travelled through towns he had previously known only as names attached to parliamentary constituencies, places that produced the coal and cotton and iron that heated and clothed and built the empire, places whose residents he had never once considered as individuals. In a village outside Kendal, an elderly weaver told him a woman had stopped to help his wife 3 weeks earlier when she'd collapsed in the market square. Had proper medical knowledge, the man said, knew what she was doing, stayed 2 hours, refused any payment, continued on her way. In a small hamlet near Grasmere, a Methodist minister mentioned a woman who had assisted his congregation's charitable efforts for a week. Organized, capable, spoke to everyone the same way regardless of their station. Everywhere, the same portrait assembled itself from different mouths. a woman of considerable capability, moving quietly through places that never expected someone of her bearing to notice them at all. Cedric rode through all of it and felt the accumulated weight of everything he had not known about her and had not thought to ask. He found the Valorian community on the third week in a cluster of modest houses at the edge of Ambleside, identified finally by the particular emblem carved discreetly into a doorpost, a small crowned bird that meant nothing to an English eye.
An old man answered his knock and told him in accented English that he had the wrong address. Cedric told him in French that he did not. There was a long silence. Then he was let inside. Helena was not there. She had been, recently, a week ago, perhaps less. The old man, who gave no name, and Cedric did not press for one, said she was safe. He said it with the protective firmness of someone who had been keeping this particular person safe for a very long time, and was not inclined to stop because an English duke arrived on the doorstep with tired eyes and muddy boots. Cedric asked him to deliver a message. The old man said nothing, which Cedric took as conditional agreement. He said, choosing his words with more care than he usually bothered to, that he had no intention of involving himself in Valorian politics or making claims on her future, that he understood if she wanted the marriage dissolved and would arrange it however she preferred, that he was not there to retrieve a wife or protect a duke's reputation or satisfy a wager that should never have existed. He was there because she had spent her entire life being used as something by somebody, and he did not want to be another entry on that particular list. The old man listened to all of this with an expression that revealed nothing. As Cedric rose to leave, the old man said quietly, without looking up from his pipe, "She is going to Whitby. There are people following her who are not friends." Cedric was back on his horse within the minute. Whitby in May smelled of fish, tar, and coming rain. The harbour town climbed its two cliffsides in tight rows of red-roofed houses, the old abbey ruins watching from the east cliff above everything, like a reminder that nothing built by men lasted as long as men believed it would. The River Esk divided the town cleanly. Fishing vessels crowded along both banks, their masts swaying in the harbour swell. By evening, the docksides were loud with returning crews, the chandleries and public houses filling quickly, the narrow streets between the warehouses growing dark well before the last light left the sky. Cedric arrived in the late afternoon and moved through the town quickly, asking nothing and watching everything. He had learned something in the past 3 weeks of riding through places he had previously ignored, that information moved most freely among people who had no reason to impress anyone. A harbour boy directed him toward the eastern wharves for a penny. A fish merchant's wife pointed him further along the quay without being asked twice. He found the warehouse on the far side of the east pier as the first serious drops of rain began to fall. What he did not anticipate was the 3 men already positioned outside it. They were not fishermen. Their coats were too good, and their eyes moved with the particular alert patience of men being paid to wait. One stood near the warehouse door. 2 more were positioned further along the quay in the shadows between stacked cargo crates. Cedric pulled back into a doorway and watched them for 2 minutes, long enough to be certain, then moved around the back of the building through a narrow passage that smelled of rope and bilge water. The rear door was unlocked. Inside, the warehouse was full of the ordinary chaos of working harbor storage: coiled rope, barrels, canvas-wrapped cargo, fishing equipment hanging from iron hooks along the beams. Helena stood near the far wall, with 2 men Cedric didn't recognize, speaking in low, urgent tones. One of the men was elderly and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone in poor health. The other was younger, broad, with the watchful stillness Cedric had come to associate with Valorian loyalists. Helena saw Cedric first. For a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that was not anger. Then the warehouse door at the front came off its hinges.
What followed happened in a compressed and violent rush that afterwards Cedric could only reconstruct in pieces. 3 men through the front, the younger Valorian moving to block them immediately, shouting in 2 languages. Cedric put himself between Helena and the nearest attacker without thinking about it consciously, which, in retrospect, was the most honest thing he had done since the whole business began. The pistol discharged close enough that he felt it before he heard it. The ball caught him high on the left side, below the shoulder, and the force of it sat him down hard against a barrel stack. He was aware of pain arriving like a delayed invoice, not immediate, then suddenly total. He pressed his hand against it and stayed upright by determination rather than any physical justification for doing so. The fight was brief and ugly. The younger Valorian was considerably more capable than his quiet manner suggested. 2 attackers went down. The 3rd ran when the odds changed. Outside, rain was hammering the key in earnest now, and somewhere across the harbor, a watch bell was ringing. Helena was beside Cedric before the noise had fully stopped. She worked with the same focused calm she had brought to everything, tearing linen from her traveling bag, pressing it firmly against the wound, assessing it with her hands in the practical way of someone who had treated injuries in worse conditions than this. She told him to keep pressure on it and not move unnecessarily. He told her he had no immediate plans to do otherwise. The elderly Valorian man bent down and examined one of the captured attackers. He said something to the younger man, who translated for Cedric's benefit. The attacker was employed through a London intermediary. The instruction chain led back to an English name, Percival Graves. Cedric closed his eyes briefly. He was not entirely surprised, which was perhaps the most unpleasant part. Helena had gone quiet. She sat beside him on the warehouse floor, with the rain loud on the roof above them, one hand still pressed against his side, and he could see from her expression that she was already calculating routes, contingencies, the next necessary movement away from here. "You should go," she said, not unkindly, "when you're well enough. Go back to London and your title and your life, and let this end cleanly." "I followed you from Ambleside to Whitby in the rain," he said. "That isn't the behavior of a man who wants a clean ending." She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, very quietly, "Everyone who has ever been close to me has paid for it." He looked at her directly. His side was burning badly and his coat was ruined, and he had approximately no leverage in this conversation, which made it considerably easier to be honest. "I'd rather lose the title than lose you again," he said. "That isn't a performance. There's nobody here to perform for." She looked at him for a long moment in the half-dark of the warehouse, with the rain coming down outside. Whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes, he waited for it to finish. She didn't leave. London received them back in silence, which was worse than noise. Cedric's wound took 3 weeks to close properly. He spent that time at Whitmore House under Helena's care, which was administered with clinical efficiency and very little sentiment, and which he found more comforting than sentiment would have been. She changed the dressing each morning without fuss. She left books outside his door without comment. She did not mention Whitby, or the warehouse, or what he had said on the floor of it, and he did not raise it either, because some things said in the dark and the rain needed daylight and steadiness before they could be properly examined. By the time June arrived, he was walking without difficulty. The invitation to the Buckingham House summer gathering came on a Wednesday, delivered on heavy cream card with the royal cipher embossed at the top. It was the most significant social occasion of the season. Foreign diplomats, senior military men, half the cabinet, and every notable family in England compressed into one evening of elaborate performance. Attendance was not compulsory. Declining, however, was a statement. Cedric told Helena they should go. She read the invitation twice and set it down on the breakfast table. "Percival will be there," she said. "I know." She looked at him with the level gaze that he had come to understand meant she was taking the full measure of a situation before responding to it. Then she said she would need 2 days to arrange a suitable gown, and that he should confirm their attendance with the household secretary. The evening arrived warm and clear. The kind of June night London produced occasionally, as though in apology for everything else it inflicted the rest of the year. Buckingham House blazed with light from every window, carriages lining the approach 3 deep, footmen in royal livery moving between them with the choreographed precision of long practice. Helena wore deep burgundy silk, nothing elaborate, no excess of jewelry or artificial height in her hair. She walked into that room beside Cedric with the same composure she had carried into every room since Blackmere Hall, and he understood now what that composure actually was. Not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of someone who had survived by never letting a room know how much it could hurt her. For an hour, everything proceeded normally. Then Percival moved. He did it in the middle of the East Ballroom during a pause in the music, which meant approximately 200 people heard every word clearly. He raised his voice with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this, and said that he felt it his duty, in the presence of assembled diplomats and representatives of the Crown, to reveal information of considerable political significance that had been deliberately concealed from English society. The room stilled. Percival said the woman known as Helena Ashcombe, Duchess of Whitmore, was in truth Princess Eleanor of Valoria, the surviving heir of a deposed foreign royal family with outstanding territorial claims that several European powers had active interest in pursuing. The silence that followed was absolute for exactly 3 seconds. Then the room erupted. Cedric watched it happen from 6 feet away, the alarm moving through the diplomatic contingent like a stone dropped in still water, the cabinet men closing together instinctively, the military officers exchanging the rapid, private glances of people calculating implications. Several women near the windows simply left. A French attaché was already making his way toward the door with considerable purpose. Helena stood completely still through all of it. Cedric stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He did not raise his voice, because the room was already quiet enough to hear him clearly. He said that Lord Percival Graves had indeed revealed something significant this evening, though perhaps not what he had intended. He said the marriage to Helena had originated as a wager, publicly made at Blackmere Hall, deliberately arranged by Percival to humiliate them both. He said this clearly and without deflection, accepting it as his own failure before every person in the room. Then he said that he had documentation connecting Percival to the men who had attacked his carriage on the road from St. Albans Chapel, to the assault at Whitby Harbour, and to the transmission of information regarding Helena's location to foreign agents operating on English soil. He named the intermediary. He named the payments. He said the word treason in a level voice and let it settle. Percival's composure broke in a way that was visible from across the room. 2 senior men from the Home Office were already moving toward him when Cedric formally requested, in front of every witness present, that the matter be heard before the Crown's appointed representatives at dawn. The duel was agreed under the formal rules of the field. Hyde Park at first light was cold and colorless, the grass dark with dew. Percival was a competent shot and a worse swordsman, and he chose pistols on that basis. Cedric let him have the choice. The exchange was single and conclusive. Cedric's ball took Percival in the right arm, which ended the matter without ending the man, and Percival, pale and undone, gave his confession before 4 witnesses while a surgeon attended to him under a gray morning sky. Helena stood at the park's edge throughout. She had refused to wait at the house. When it was over and Cedric walked back toward her across the wet grass, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not relief, something older and quieter than that. The particular look of someone who has finally put down a weight they carried so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight without it. She said nothing. She handed him his coat. They walked back to the carriage together as the city woke around them. Autumn came to Northumberland the way it always did, without apology. The moors turned copper and rust almost overnight, the birch trees along the estate's eastern boundary dropping their leaves in slow drifts that gathered against the stone walls and the garden gates. The sky sat low and wide and grey above everything, the kind of sky that pressed gently down on the land rather than threatening it. Wood smoke rose from the tenant cottages in thin columns each morning. The harvest was good that year, better than the previous two, and the villagers surrounding Whitmore Estate went into winter with their larders reasonably full, which was not always the case and was therefore noted with genuine gratitude. The estate itself had continued its quiet transformation through the summer months and into the autumn. A schoolroom had been built in the village of Hartwick, half a mile from the estate's southern gate, funded without announcement and opened without ceremony in July. 23 children attended its first morning, sent by parents who had received the offer with a mixture of suspicion and cautious hope. By September, the number had grown to 31. Helena visited twice a week and taught reading on Thursday afternoons with the same focused attention she gave to everything.
The small medical dispensary attached to the estate's old laundry building had become, by October, the first place the mining families of the surrounding valleys came when someone was hurt or sick. Helena had trained 2 women from the village to assist with the simpler treatments, and she worked alongside them without distinction of rank in a manner that the local physician initially found professionally offensive and then, observing the results, quietly began to respect. Cedric managed the estate's broader affairs and found, to his own surprise, that he was considerably better at it now than he had been before. Something about the previous year had stripped away the habit of performing competence in favor of actually applying it. He spent more time with the tenant farmers, less time in London. He wrote fewer letters to people at court and more letters to people who knew things worth knowing: engineers, physicians, agricultural reformers.
His mother visited in September, spent 3 days, and left without her customary catalogue of complaints. This, in itself, was remarkable. London still talked. It would likely always talk. The pamphlets and the drawing room conversations had moved on from cruelty to something more complicated, a mixture of grudging reassessment and persistent myth-making that turned Helena into various things she was not, depending on who was doing the telling. She was indifferent to most of it. On one occasion, a particularly vicious piece appeared in a periodical, and Cedric found it on the breakfast table, and she was eating her toast with complete equanimity, and he thought that said everything necessary about how far she had come, and equally, how little those voices had ever deserved her attention. They had not spoken again about Whitby, not directly. But things had shifted between them in the way that things shift when 2 people have stood in enough difficult places together that pretense becomes more effort than honesty. One evening in late October, the estate held its harvest gathering in the long barn behind the kitchen gardens. It was a yearly tradition that previous dukes had attended briefly and formally. Cedric stayed until midnight, and Helena stayed beside him, and at some point during the fiddler's 3rd set, she laughed genuinely at something an old farmer said, and Cedric realized he had been watching her laugh the way a man watches something he is afraid will stop. Later that night, when the barn had emptied and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, they sat together in the library with the fire burning low. It was comfortable in the specific way that takes a long time to build and cannot be manufactured. Helena said, looking at the fire rather than at him, that there was one thing she had not told him.
He waited. She said the medicines, the compounds that had altered her appearance from childhood, had not been medically necessary for a very long time. The physicians who originally administered them had been clear that the effects were largely permanent after a certain age, and that continuation served no physiological purpose. She had continued taking them herself, long after necessity, because the body she lived in had become its own disguise. Being overlooked, dismissed, invisible to the kind of people who made decisions about other people's lives. It had kept her alive. She had not known how to want anything different. She said it in a steady voice, but her hands in her lap,
were not steady. Cedric looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across and took the small glass bottle from her coat pocket. The one she had been carrying for so long, it had worn a permanent shape into the fabric. He stood, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames without ceremony.
She watched the fire take it. He sat back down and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. She already knew. The fire crackled between them, and the autumn wind moved against the windows, and the room held its quiet, the way rooms do when the people inside them have finally arrived somewhere they intend to stay. She turned toward him, and for the first time since a burning palace in a country that existed now only in the memories of old men, Eleanor of Valoria allowed herself to simply be a woman, sitting beside someone who knew everything and had stayed anyway. Outside, the copper leaves fell in the dark. The story was finished.